Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
All right, great. Let's get started. So welcome to SIG Auth for May 16th. Eric, would you like to talk about the SIG PM representative role?
Yeah, so SIG PM has a representative list that is largely there to help them manage the features and have an idea of what the SIGs are doing, as well as communicate back to the SIGs about what they intend us to do in terms of planning and road mapping and that kind of thing. As part of that, there are some requirements around the SIGs actually having somebody going and attending their meetings. Right now, CJ Cullen is the one sole representative of SIG Auth in that group, and if anyone would like to help out with that effort, it would be meeting about 3 to 5 times during the release and just showing up to the SIG PM group. And if anybody wants to be a secondary and help represent SIG Auth and identify what our feature roadmaps are or any requirements that SIG PM has of us, that would be really helpful. And so there are a few links in the meeting notes to talk about how you go and sign up. But if somebody wants to volunteer, then I'm more than happy to endorse them for that.
All right, thanks. If anyone's interested, please reach out to us and we can get that set up. All right, polls of note, escalating RBAC grants. Jordan, I believe this is your PR. Do you want to talk about this?
Sure. So if anyone has used a GKE cluster in particular, one of the things you will notice is that when you first start up, your IAM user has full API permissions by virtue of the GKE webhook authorization. But if it tries to do anything RBAC related, like create some cluster roles, you're deploying a manifest that has some cluster roles, it gets forbidden with an error that says you're trying to grant permissions that you don't have. So if you want to jump into that issue, it kind of summarizes it. And the reason for that is that RBAC, to prevent escalation attacks, before you bind a role, it requires you to have all of the permissions in the role that you're binding. And before you create or update a role, it requires you to have all of the permissions that you are trying to add into the system. And it requires you to have those permissions via RBAC objects or bindings, because that's what it can actually inspect. And so that works fine if the only authorizer you're using is the RBAC authorizer. But if you're using something like GKE, where there are multiple authorizers in place, you've got sort of cluster API defined authorization rules and IAM defined authorization rules. Those don't play nicely together. I mean, it fails safe. You get forbidden, rather than it saying, well, I don't know what to do. I've got multiple authorizers, so I guess I'll just let you go ahead. But it causes problems in like bootstrapping cases where you are actually a super user in IAM and you could do anything to any API you want, but RBAC is saying, I don't know. I don't know if you have these permissions or not, so I'm going to say no. And so what we are wanting to do is define a specific authorization check. So we already did this for binding, creating role bindings. When you create a role binding, if you already have all the permissions in the role you're binding, then it's allowed. Or if the authorizer explicitly authorizes the bind verb, then it's allowed. So that gives GKE or an external authorizer a way to kind of give a thumbs up to letting someone perform a role binding. And so this is wanting to do something similar for defining roles. And So the approach is basically the same. The question that's open is, what do we name that sort of special check? We talked about like escalate. That doesn't quite fit. The thing that we are wanting to check if you have permission to do is, are you allowed to define RBAC permissions that you don't currently have via RBAC? So I think we're looking for kind of a name or a description of that. People have
I also didn't have a great feeling about putting that verb on the role as opposed to the binding. It seems like the question we're asking is, or sorry, yeah. It's like, are you able to create escalating roles? That's not something that applies to a specific role.
If you're allowed to create escalating roles, then you're effectively root in the cluster, right?
Yeah. Not necessarily. If I can create roles, but I can't grant them to anyone or even to myself, right. Like this could be a role maintaining bot, right? Whose job is to mirror role definitions from one system into another system. And that's literally the only thing it can do.
Okay, so we're saying the union of the bind and the escalate permission makes you root in the cluster. If
you can bring in RBAC permissions you don't currently have, and you can grant them, then that can. I don't really expect. I don't really expect this to be used for much other than what we're seeing here, where you are a super user in some other system, and you're just trying to define your RBAC roles. That's really all you're trying to do, and it's silly that you, as a super user, cannot do that. Mm-hmm. But I agree. We want to pick a name carefully. So yeah, that's the issue. I guess if anyone has great ideas right now, I'd love to hear them. If people have strong feelings against the current state, or they have other suggestions and want to comment out of band in the poll, that's fine as well. I don't know, CJ, was there anything else you wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, the only escalate sounds scary to people. Like, we tell people don't allow privilege escalation, and then we're going to say, oh, by the way, you need this escalate verb if you want to do anything with RBAC in your cluster. Now,
well, most people my view of that is, if you're a super user, you have the escalate verb, and if you don't, then you should be slightly scared to grant this. Like, you shouldn't. This should be the kind of thing that would give you pause.
Yeah.
I don't know that escalate is exactly the right word, but the fact that it's a little scary, I'm actually okay with.
Yeah, I want, like, would it be too confusing to call it create escalating? I mean, we can, if no one has strong opinions here, we can bike shed on it later and just pick something.
So create escalating, multiple words seems weird. Create, I don't know. Like, define, the more generic you got, the less scary it sounded. Like, I don't want it to be just define or something like that. It needs to be just the right level of scary.
Is there a reason that you have, like, if you can update roles or delete roles, you could possibly, like, create a new role that, you know, has the same name as one where an existing role binding exists, which would, you know, give you full access, but it seems pretty safe to, if you could only create new roles.
I don't think we want to draw a line between create and update, especially with, like, the declarative config stuff coming in, where people generally use apply. And so I think we would, this sort of secondary check, that is checking, are you allowed to put the particular permissions into this role? I don't think we want to distinguish between create and update.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's just the lack of referential integrity in Kubernetes making that an impossible task. We can't actually say for sure that there does or does not already exist a role binding referring to this name.
So, yeah, if anyone else wants to chime in, that's fine. If not, we can.
Care about this is only if you want something that is less than cluster admin. If you have full access anyway, it's unnecessary, right?
Or if, I mean, so like GKE IAM, they, correct me if I'm wrong, CJ, I don't think it defines super user as star on star. Like it actually still has an enumerated list.
Yeah, our permission system doesn't have, yeah, the star expansion actually explicitly expands to a set of known permissions. So like even our IAM owner role is just a shorthand to enumerate the full set of permissions that GCP knows about. So we can't actually answer the question, do you have all the permissions? Because all the I mean, we could, but like that's an ever-changing thing that doesn't really make sense for us to answer. Yeah, answer the question in the chat. Star is a shorthand for defining a role, not for answering a permission question.
Yeah, so again, this really, the main reason it matters is when you're crossing authorizers and some other authorizer you want to allow to let you define roles.
Are we the only ones that do that? Does anybody else have a case where they actually loop in another authorizer that allows you to kind of make the jump into RBAC land?
I know other setups that use multiple authorizers, but I think in most cases, RBAC is the bootstrap one. I think GKE is unusual in that they don't actually bootstrap RBAC stuff.
Or is it a... It is a GKE only thing, but it is a common issue.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not GKE only. It's a multiple authorizer issue. So I think it's worth addressing. If only so I don't have to answer this question.
Yeah, you and me both, Jordan.
All right. We can.
I have a question about the implementation on this.
Yep.
Is escalate, does that also implicitly grant create, or do I need both create and escalate?
This is a secondary check. So all the normal authorization has already been done by the time you get to this check. So if you're doing a create, you must have create cluster role permissions. If you're doing an update, you must have update cluster role permissions. Then you get into the storage handler, and the RBAC one does this special check.
So I have a more generic question then, which is, with these special permission verbs, it's really like a permission-only verb. Escalate would be one example, and then the use verb on the pod security policies is another example. Should those show up in our discovery API in any way? Because they don't currently.
Whoever is typing and is unmuted, we can hear you pretty extremely.
We don't know who you are, but we can hear you.
Yes.
So I view discovery documents as useful for the person making the API request. So if I'm making an API request, I know that this resource supports create and delete and whatever else. These permission checks don't really affect me making the API request. They affect the person who is building policy. So I don't know that it's super important for it to show up in discovery. I don't think any client would be able to do anything automatically in response to it showing up in discovery.
Yeah, I guess one example of where it would be useful is if you're building tooling around setting up RBAC permissions. And for instance, if you have a UI or something, and you wanted to enumerate all of the different permissions and let users kind of navigate through those permissions and select them. The discovery endpoint could be used to kind of enumerate all of the permissions that they might care about.
Yeah, I think one of the characteristics of the authorization interface we have is that you can ask it arbitrary questions.
Right.
And so we've got a couple, use, bind, and whatever we end up with here. We have a few known examples where we're using it for specific queries, but you can actually use it generically, and people do. I think you're going to have a hard time sort of gathering a definitive list of all possible uses of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just my feeling. But anyway, I don't know that there's a lot more to say on this. If you have thoughts or opinions, please weigh in for or against the current state, and we'll stew on it a little while longer. But I would like to get some form of this into 111, which closes in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that.
Sounds good. Let's move on to the next topic, which is something I threw on here. I was recently kind of going through all of our add-on base images and noticed that a lot of our images that are based off of Alpine do so basically just to install the CA certificates package. My first thought was, well, maybe we should have some sort of Kubernetes base image that just includes CA certificates. But then I was thinking that actually, I think building CA certificates into container images is a bit of an anti-pattern. It means that you can't easily revoke certificates without rebuilding and redeploying your workloads. It's hard to add organization-specific certificates to public images. And there's poor visibility into what certs are trusted across the cluster. And so I was thinking about how we might be able to support this use case better in Kubernetes and have sort of cluster managed CA certs. One kind of simple approach is to just dump them into config maps and mount those into the containers at the right path. That does mean, since we don't currently have any cross namespace config map references, in the current state, you would need to create those certificates in every namespace. This has come up also in the context of the root CA for the cluster. So it sort of overlaps with that, the discussion of how to handle the Kubernetes root CA, but I was curious what folks thought on the idea of cluster managed CA certs.
So is there really any difference between this and a cluster managed config map injected into containers? I mean, it is a specific case, but I think I go once a day and someone brings up, man, I wish I could have this config map in 2 namespaces. Is it just a small step from CA to generic config map across namespaces?
Yeah, so I think it is. That's kind of the question that I brought up at the very end here. One piece that would be slightly different is if we wanted to add the ability to auto-inject the certificates into every container. So something along the lines of auto-mount service account token.
Pod preset was supposed to solve that, right? So we could always do cluster pod preset. I mean, it's a more general problem, but with some of the same trade-offs that pod preset had. Like, can someone use this to attack infrastructure pods by overwriting things that the author didn't expect to overwrite? And effectively, that's what this is. So, I mean, like, if you're cluster admin, you could probably make this distinction. So there's kind of that weird spot when we jump out of the namespace, we start getting into the difference between cluster admin and someone who wants to do this across multiple namespaces but isn't a cluster admin. That's also another wrinkle. Like in that, if we did like cluster pod preset or something like that, or anything that's injecting, if it's only the cluster admin that could do it, or someone who's effectively equivalent to cluster admin, it does limit its use for, you know, some set of use cases.
Mm-hmm. Do we have cluster pod presets today?
No, it was proposed, but it was, you know, cluster pod presets got really close, and then we're like, yeah, let's kick it out of tree because we're doing that, and it's kind of languished a little bit. It's not hard to do. This has come up. Someone else, there were two other cluster scoped policy objects that someone proposed recently that were basically just small variants on the namespace scoped one, where it was, again, it was a very similar pattern. Like, it's really useful. I'd like to do it across namespaces, and it kind of runs up against the multi-tenancy discussions where we haven't ever figured out how to do anything between cluster scope or cluster namespace and namespace scope.
Yeah.
It would make, so the other one that's very common, and that's why cluster pod preset comes up, is proxy environment variables. Is probably the number one thing that I think I get one email a day about someone wanting to do environment variables across a whole cluster because of proxy, or but proxy is the most common one. I think there was a couple of others that I've heard, which felt very cluster pod preset. Cluster admin says, I want to use this HTTP proxy across everything, unless the individual user overrides it and does their own thing, which is a very pod preset-y type action.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess if we have cluster config maps and cluster pod presets, this really just becomes a kind of a life cycle question of, is this something we want to bootstrap and sort of, you know, have an expectation that this will be available within a cluster?
Is this trying to solve problems that are coming up with the platform, or an application level problems? Because if it's application level, is that really within the scope of Kubernetes?
I mean, you could maybe make the argument that config maps are in the scope of Kubernetes, and so whether your namespace scoped or not, there are clusters that are applications, and there are namespaces that are applications. I think it's a valid point to do that. It's certainly something that would be best as an extension alongside something like pod presets potentially. The config map part is weird because we would have to basically invent a new volume type. That's really the ugly state we're in, is that you can't add a new volume type without changing the kubelet.
Mm-hmm.
As evidenced by Mike's PR. And maybe this is like a good opportunity to pull together the use cases around pod preset and give them a little bit more kick and say, you know, being able to mount a dynamic volume. I don't even know cluster is what's the extension mechanism for storage? CSI. Is CSI even beta yet? I'm always confused.
I think it's going to beta in 1.11.
Because a combination of CSI plus config map would solve a couple of those problems and could be done out of core, but
I think it would be pretty nice to have cross namespace config map references. That's something that I was considering pushing on.
The authorizer, the node authorizer is really hard for it because you don't have you basically have to do both directions. Check against ACL or something.
For config map, though?
Yeah, because I could use it to, I could just say, oh, I referenced this config map in the admin cluster. Just because it's a config map doesn't mean that the data in it isn't potentially compromising across namespaces. Like, if that was true, then everybody on the cluster would access config maps.
Sure.
Across all namespaces.
I just something unrelated or somewhat related. In general, you can use Docker's from directive to basically build from Alpine, get the certificates, and then do start from scratch and get the certificates into that image. So that original problem could be solved just by orchestrating the image build.
Well, what I was trying to get at was I think actually building the certificates into the image in the first place is not great.
But I think, I interpreted your sort of what drives this is reducing the attack surface of some of those images in Kubernetes.
I think there's one other aspect, which is being able to update those certificate bundles as certificates come and go.
Yeah. In a sense, we're kind of talking about something running on top of Kubernetes that is in a, what's the word for it? Where two things are dependent on each other.
Circular dependency.
Symbiotic. There's a symbiotic relationship between apps that take advantage of the platform that are reactive to config maps, reactive to secrets. Platform enables tools that make those to react, stateful sets, services and endpoints. We do kind of lack. We're just getting to the point where we're starting to use config maps and secrets in components and make that easy. And cross namespace config maps can be managed at a higher level, but they're annoying. We have had the discussion about whether this could just be an API call, and that basically is the same thing as building a flex volume or CSI plugin, which is just encoding that logic into an extension to Kube that makes it easy for that to happen. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I will try and link to those cluster level config map and pod preset discussions from this.
One more point too is that the fan out on a cluster config map to pods would be pretty high, so that's something to also keep in mind. The implications for secret refresh and config map refresh on global scope things is kind of scary in some cases.
Mm-hmm.
Taking this to an extreme, I think what we have is some files on disks that we want to manage separately from the container image, what the container image packages. So would you consider potentially a similar mechanism for updating libc? For example, it might be useful to have a single libc across a cluster and update that independently of container images. Can we extend a mechanism to handle updates of common shared libraries?
I mean, the Docker image volume, container image volume proposal had that use case called out. At the time, it was more limitations in Docker. I know DIMS did a prototype with a flex volume that was just, bare bones stupid. I do kind of think that there is an analogy there of if we have an API mechanism that establishes a channel from a centrally managed thing to the nodes, we should be consistent about it, whether it's config map secrets or volumes that are doing that sort of synchronization.
Mm-hmm.
It really is a shame because, it would be, if CSI was a little bit lower bar, it would be trivial to create a CSI plugin that implemented any number of these things with a CRD. It doesn't even have to be cluster config maps. It could just be a CRD that, either an admin sets or you set. I think we're really it's still too hard to build these things and to show them working with the infrastructure that we have.
Clayton, I'm not sure if that's what you were talking about or not, but there's an issue from way back in 2014 about supporting data volumes, like data images.
Yeah, and it keeps coming up just because a lot of people want to compose like for serverless style workloads or Heroku build pack style workloads where you have an image that has your source code and an image that has your runtime, and nothing about images says they have to have glibc of them, or Node.js runtime, et cetera. So that issue, I feel like everybody kind of wants something like it, but nobody needs it enough that it has ever reached escape velocity, given the amount of changes to the kubelet to make it happen. So it kind of languishes. And there's not a ton of difference between like putting a glibc inside an image and using it in an image volume from putting a CA bundle and a bunch of static config in an image and delivering it the same way, and doing encryption of that image or something so that it's a payload that gets delivered, from a serverless bundle that's just a tar file of Node.js scripts, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, maybe we should move on to the next topic.
Yeah, I put this on. So I wanted to just kind of briefly talk about something we ran into recently where someone had been kind of updating, upgrading a cluster since 1.5, and they were kind of been dragging along with them a series of kind of backwards compatible things that meant that if they had created a new cluster, they were actually much more secure than kind of like upgrading an existing cluster over a period of time. And like I linked to kind of one example, even though they were like fairly security savvy, they didn't realize they had ABAC still on in this cluster. I wanted to kind of like raise this as a sort of discussion topic. In the doc, you can see Yisui's kind of talked about the security profile work, and I think that helps. Do we think that is enough? Like, should there be? Do we need like some sort of deprecation for the backwards compatibility pieces or something at some point, on top of kind of just, I guess, kind of monitoring of the security state of a cluster via something like a security profile, like an external mechanism?
I think we'd want to kind of distinguish between settings and roles and things that are intended to interact with Kubernetes components that we can reason about. We say we can have kubelets up to 2 versions older than the API server, and so if 3 versions after we've dropped some function from the kubelet, I think we can do something to automatically remove that permission or tighten that up. However, if it's a role or something that is being used like as a general purpose thing, or even in the case where like the RBAC roles are for nodes, we don't know that everybody's using the node authorizer. So that's why we continue carrying that role. I don't think we can automatically tighten that. I do think we should have tooling or detection that you are in a looser than default state. So I know that some of the low-level tools that we have, like the role reconciliation, will actually detect like if the bootstrap roles have extra permissions. Like we have that detection today. Finding a way to surface that or make that available, whether it's part of the security profile work or just on startup, when we do the reconciliation, if you've got extra permissions, put nasty things in the log or something, like starting to surface that and make that visible would be a good step.
Is there any way you would see that? How would you actually see that today? Like, what would you have to do? You mentioned, I think it was a reconciliation or something.
So reconciliation happens at API server start. So today we are telling you if new roles were added or missing permissions were added. I forget if we log if there are extra permissions or not. But reconciliation can also be run from kube control. So you can feed in like the default policy and say, reconcile this. And today it's additive only, but all the logic is there to notice when you have extra stuff, and it could tell you about it and optionally strip that out if you wanted. I think we've actually done a really good job of making upgrades be non-events for the authorization stuff. Like, I can probably count on one hand the number of issues we've seen with it. And so that does a lot for people's confidence. Like, nobody says, oh, should I upgrade? I'm afraid my roles are going to go haywire. And so that the fact that nobody even asks that question is really, really great. And so we don't want to make it so people are scared to upgrade because they think we're going to break stuff from under them. But finding a way to surface when they could improve things is good.
Yeah, I agree with the importance of the backwards compat, and we definitely want people to be able to upgrade. But yeah, I get the feeling that there's like a lot of old clusters that are in this state that have been upgraded along many times, and people don't really have any idea how to, like, what are all the little traps that they've set to themselves by doing that.
Potentially,
I mean, the big ones are you using always allow? Are you using ABAC? Do you have like really broad cluster admin bindings? Like, those are the three that are really going to bite people hard. And they're not, I mean, depending on the way you're characterizing your cluster, they're not invalid, but they are definitely not like production level hardened.
I think we're going to have to find a separate solution for component configuration and RBAC policy configuration. I think we can probably make improvements to kube control, auth reconcile fairly easily, potentially add diff support, and be able to target the bootstrap policies for a specific release branch, maybe. Those seem like low-hanging fruit. Improving component config. Introspection will allow will allow development of more accurate and easier to use benchmarking and security benchmarking tools. So
if I can point something at my cluster and get like a scorecard, like the SSL TLS scorecard thing that goes through and looks at your server and scans it, and I mean, obviously it can do that just by talking to the endpoints, but something at that level of difficulty where you just say, here's my startup, here's my config, you know, tell me what I'm doing wrong, and make me work to get a green A+ check mark, whatever.
Yeah, that's also what I mentioned in the comment about the CIS benchmark, because I think that's kind of the closest equivalent we have to that at the moment. And so I'm not sure what use we actually said about that. But yeah.
The current CIS defines the rules to validate the command line flags and file permissions. And according to the spec, it currently supports the Kubernetes version 1.6, 1.7, and 1.8. And I think it's time to evolve that because a new version comes out and a bunch of command line flags changed. So
yeah, I think it's a little chicken and the egg there. Like, if we had a good way to measure it and evaluate clusters against it, everyone would be wanting those things updated as quickly as possible and, you know, fresh versions. But like, while there isn't like a great way to evaluate, then yeah, it's kind of less useful. You have to do a lot of manual work. Okay, we can move on.
Sorry, Zoom crashed for me for a minute there.
The next one's the exec auth plugin anyway, so I can just comment on that unless whoever put this on here wants to have a specific question.
Yeah. So the exec auth plugin is the feature that are designed for 111 for alpha, if I'm not wrong. And there's already 2 public implementations, one using AWS IAM credentials, the other one using GCP VM identity token. The question I had is, since there seems to be a decent level of interest, would it be possible to launch this in beta in 111 instead of alpha to get more people to actually use it? Or what are the requirements to do so?
Yeah, so I was having a similar conversation with some of the Heptio Authenticator maintainers. It doesn't seem like there are a lot of issues so far by people who have been using this plugin interface and been writing code against it. So that gives me a bit of confidence around this graduating to beta. I had some initial concerns around maybe the way that the inputs get passed in, and also just general Windows support, because I'm not entirely familiar with what that development environment looks like. Overall, I think that the biggest sort of way that we could push this forward is if plugin maintainers who are writing against these interface can drop into that issue and just say, we are working with this, we've seen no issues, we don't have any feature requests or changes, we'd like to see this, and we would like this to go beta. I think that would, to me, would be a good way of moving it forward. And I can write down my specific concerns to be addressed as well.
Can you link to the issue?
Yeah.
So Eric, I'm not sure. Did that sound like maybe yes beta for 111 or?
That's. I mean, why don't I write down my specific concerns, and then if those are not shared by people who have been using and writing against the plugin, then we can promote it to beta, and that's fine for me.
Are there code changes to promote to beta?
Yes, the configuration format has to be the API. The configuration format uses the API machinery stuff, so that needs to be promoted over to beta, and I can do that.
Okay, because we've already passed feature freeze. I'm not sure if this qualifies in that. But it may be good to run it by the release owner.
The feature already exists.
Yeah, this is the exec auth plugin feature, which was already filed.
Yeah. Okay, anything else on that topic, or should we move on? All right, Clayton, it looks like you next one up.
Yeah, I'll keep this short. It's come up a couple of times, people who have pull secrets for the cluster, and as we move to more dynamic config and bootstrapped clusters, it's getting more annoying for people to manage credentials on different container runtimes like Containerd or Docker or Cryo or any of the 17 others that exist out there. I wanted to at least float the idea with this SIG and with SIG Node about adding a credential provider. And this is really similar to the secret one in some respects. I just wanted to keep it separate, at least for now, which is there's a specific use case for the credential provider with infrastructure, which is you want secrets that the cluster can't see to allow you to pull images, or you want to distribute it across your nodes. The infrastructure images on the node, daemon sets that are shared or part of a standard infrastructure. We have credential providers for the cloud, but we don't have a credential provider for Kubernetes itself. And so I had just been talking with a couple of people about would a credential provider for the kubelet that fetch secrets from the cluster for the purposes of image pull secrets, adding a global image pull secret. David had a couple of comments like you probably wouldn't want just one, or you could conceivably have different ones. The case that I'm thinking of is very much like one per cluster. It's the one that you use to pull every infrastructure image, whether that's the pod image or wherever you're getting your daemon sets from. But I definitely think there's a set of use cases outside of it where you might actually want to have separate ones, and there's no way to group nodes today. So I don't think we have to discuss much here. I didn't know if there was anybody felt that resonated with cases that they'd had or seemed totally out of line with what credential provider is intended to accomplish. Okay, I'll open an issue, and then if people want to comment to it, I'm going to bring up a SIG node as well.
Yeah, sounds good. I think SIG node would maybe have more to say on the issue. All right, is there anything else anyone has to discuss? Actually, one piece to mention is the governance proposal has been out for a while. There was one comment about temporary leave for leadership roles that has been resolved. And so if no one has any other concerns with that, we'll probably merge that today. All right, I guess that's all we have. So have a good week, everyone.